The rule of the Republic was simple. A general returning from war was purified in ceremony, separated from his army at the boundary of the city. He was required to give the glory to Jupiter rather than himself. The triumph existed precisely to prevent what Rome feared most, a general who confused the Senate's permission for his own right. On the second day of September, 46 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar entered Rome to celebrate 4 triumphs at once. Before him walked the senators of the Republic in white togas, clearing his path. Behind him walked a boy, his great-nephew, learning the geometry of power by watching the broad back of a man who had conquered the world. Behind the boy, 50,000 veterans held aloft boards nailed with the severed hands of the enemy. The crowds had been standing since dawn. As Caesar's chariot rolled through the velabrum, the axle broke. The crowd went silent. He stepped down. He looked at the broken wood. He got back into the chariot and continued. Suetonius recorded this without comment. History remembers Caesar's Quadruple Triumph as the most magnificent celebration of the Roman Empire. In truth, it was the most lavish and gilded funeral ever orchestrated for a dying republic. The roaring crowds were not celebrating their general's victories. They were being systematically bribed into permanent subjugation. As severed hands and chained kings were paraded, the silent, humiliated aristocracy was forced to witness their own obsolescence. Caesar believed the deafening applause of the masses was a mandate of his unquestionable supremacy. How does a man, hailed as a living god, fail to hear the sharpening of daggers beneath the cheers? In reality, he had merely fed himself to a machine that had been consuming men for centuries. The engine of empire. The late summer heat of August, bleeding into the month of September, in the year 46 BC, hung thick over the hills of Rome. Rome was vibrating with an unprecedented, almost suffocating anticipation. Gaius Julius Caesar, the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world, had returned. He had completed the wars in Europe. He had conquered Pompey in Macedonia. He had taken Egypt. He had returned from Syria and the Euxine Sea, and he was intending to advance into Libya. He commanded the world. The world was now required to watch him celebrate it. He did not come merely to celebrate a victory. He did not come merely to offer a traditional thanksgiving to the gods. He came to orchestrate a visual and political spectacle the likes of which the Republic had never seen. The Republic had already ceased to breathe, yet the corpse was about to be draped in gold. To comprehend the crushing weight of the moment, one must observe the bureaucratic strangulation of the Senate that preceded the festival. Caesar did not rely on naked violence alone. He utilized the law. The legal framework of the Republic became an inescapable trap for the optimates. After his military victories, the Senate convened in the Curia. They faced an architectural and political dead end. Caesar held the dictatorial imperium. He manipulated the tribunate to bypass senatorial authority, ensuring that the traditional mechanisms of veto were neutralized. The senators, aware of his veteran legions, camped just outside the Pomerium, voted to grant him the dictatorship for 10 years. They awarded him the Praefectura Morum, the absolute control over public morals and the senatorial role. This legal maneuver stripped the aristocracy of their ancestral protection. They were forced to vote for a Thanksgiving festival of 40 days, double the duration ever granted to any Roman before him. The constitutional safeguards were completely inverted. To oppose him legally was impossible. To oppose him physically was treason. The old order was trapped in a cage forged by their own precedents. They had granted Lucius Cornelius Sulla similar powers decades earlier. Caesar weaponized their own historical concessions against them. The elites were ordered to walk ahead of the triumphal chariot. The highest magistrates of the Republic, men whose ancestors had expelled the kings, served as the outriders for a warlord. They wore their white togas with the purple border. They stepped and looked at the cobblestones. They did not speak. The legal decrees they had signed bound them to this procession. The aristocracy was forced to publicly endorse the man who had usurped their authority. Their physical presence in the parade validated the new regime. The architecture of spectacle. We stand at the threshold of a definitive fracture in Western history. For centuries, the ancient ritual of the triumphus was strictly governed by tradition, sanctioned by the Senate to purify a returning army. A general could only celebrate a victory over a hostis, a foreign enemy of the state. Caesar, returning from a brutal, world-spanning civil war, understood the necessity of this illusion. Over the course of a single, dizzying month, he would execute the Quadruple Triumph. 4 distinct processions, celebrating victories in Gaul, Alexandria, Pontus, and Africa. Appian recounts in his histories of the civil wars that the 4 triumphs were executed with a deliberate, agonizing interval of just a single day between each. This rhythm gave the citizens no time to recover, creating an unrelenting display of Caesar's global dominion. To the cheering plebeians who lined the streets, it was ostensibly a traditional thanksgiving to the gods of Rome, a month-long festival of divine favor. The Gallic triumph went first, and Suetonius says it was the most elaborate. The exhausted plebeian masses crowded the avenues. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the blinding heat. They did not speak of the old laws. They did not speak of the murdered institutions. They waited for the lavishness of his expenditure on public entertainments. They waited for the systemic bribery that would buy their permanent subjugation. A cloud of light and flying sand rose at the end of the avenue. The vanguard of the procession materialized. The clatter of hoofs struck the stone pavement, followed by the steady, deafening whir of wheels. Ahead of the rest, 2 dark Numidian outriders rode into view. They wore bright red mantles that burned against the dusty, sun-bleached backdrop of the city. They pricked along their white African steeds, the horses tossing their heads as their iron-shod hooves struck sparks against the stone. Men carried massive wooden placards listing the names of 300 subjugated nations and 800 conquered cities. Elaborate paintings depicted the dark forests of the Rhine and the turbulent waters of the ocean. The visual narrative presented Caesar as the master of geography itself. Behind them rolled a comfortable, 4-wheeled, covered carriage, heavily ornamented with handsome embossed plate work of bronze. The metal flashed in the September sun, a glare that forced the watching plebeians to shield their eyes. 2 sleek, jet-black steeds, their coats shining with sweat, whirled it swiftly onward, driven by a sturdy man whose ponderous hands held the powerful animals in strict check. An open wagon loaded with baggage rattled closely behind, pulled by a couple of speedy gray mules, with two smart-looking slave boys sitting atop the cargo, watching the endless sea of faces pass by. Then, the legions advanced. The tramp of 50,000 military boots shook the foundations of the buildings. These were the veterans who had marched through Gaul, who had survived the sands of Egypt, who had crossed the seas. They held heavy wooden boards aloft. Nailed to the wood were the severed right hands of the enemy. The flesh was gray. The blood had dried into dark, crusty flakes beneath the relentless sun. Hundreds of hands. Thousands of severed hands. The physical remnants of foreign resistance, paraded before the exhausted plebeians. The crowd erupted. The roar of the masses slammed against the marble facades. They cheered for the severed hands. They cheered for the slaughter. Soldiers sang, as they always sang in these processions, the Carmina, the traditional songs that the army composed and performed, and that the records preserve because their content was striking enough to remember. The song that survived from the Gallic triumph is recorded by Suetonius in the original Latin. Urbani, servate exores. Mocum calvam aducimus. Orum in Gallia effutuisti, hic subsisti mutuum. The translation that follows is the cleanest available. Men of Rome, lock up your wives. We're bringing home the bald adulterer. Gold, in Gaul you spent in dalliance, which you borrowed here in Rome. This was the traditional license of the Roman triumph. The soldiers could say what they liked about their general. It was permitted. It was part of the ceremony. The custom was old enough that its origins were disputed even in antiquity. It was a ritual venting, a formal acknowledgement that the man in the chariot ahead of them was mortal. Caesar received the song without recorded response and continued toward the Capitol. And there, standing at the absolute center of the world's gaze, was the triumphal chariot. Julius Caesar wore the purple and gold. Years ago, he had been created Flamen Dialis, a mere priest of Jupiter. He had defied the old regime by parading the bust of Marius at his aunt's funeral and restoring Marius trophies to the Capitol. Now, he required no trophies, but the world itself. He held the leather reins with rigid posture, his eyes scanning the endless sea of plebeians, calculating the exact geometry of his dominance. Walking directly behind the chariot in the dirt was a boy. It was the young Caesar, the great nephew whom the dictator had now adopted. Caesar had ordered the boy to follow his chariot, bestowing upon him premature military honors. Walking in the blinding dust kicked up by the iron-bound wheels, the youth watched the broad back of his adopted father. He was learning the architecture of absolute power. Later that day, at the sacrifices and when entering the sacred temples, Caesar would station the boy at his side. He ordered the senior magistrates and the highest nobility of Rome to yield precedence to the youth. And the older men would yield, eyes fixed on the marble floor, swallowing the bitter bile of their humiliation. The cold vault of the Capitol. The physical reality of the Gallic triumph emphasized total, uncompromising conquest. For days, wagons laden with wealth rolled past the rostra. But the spectacle demanded a final, brutal punctuation. At the center of the procession, marching in heavy, humiliating chains, was a man who had once commanded a nation. Vercingetorix, the great chieftain of the Veni coalition who had defied Caesar at Alesia. Years before, he had galloped out of his stronghold, laid his arms at Caesar's feet, and surrendered. For 6 agonizing years, he had been kept rotting in a Roman dungeon, preserved alive solely for this specific afternoon. He walked slowly. His armor, once worn during the bitter siege of Alesia, was displayed on a wooden trophy behind him. The heavy iron chains dragged against the pavement, carving faint white lines into the stone. His hair was matted. His skin was pale from years devoid of sunlight, completely alien beneath the fierce Italian glare. The crowd jeered, throwing refuse, but he looked straight ahead at the massive structure of the Capitol. The procession halted at the base of the hill. A ritualized silence fell over the center of the world. Vercingetorix was detached from the main column. According to traditional custom, as Caesar's chariot turned to offer sacrifices to Jupiter, the Gaul was led away in the opposite direction. He was pushed toward a low, dark doorway and taken down into a vault beneath the Capitol. Beneath the earth, enclosed by cold, unyielding blocks of tufa stone, lies a damp, lightless subterranean chamber. Today, we know this space as the Tullianum, the Mamertine prison. It was the prison below the Capitoline Hill, where Rome held those it intended to display and then kill. The heavy wooden door closes. The sunlight is severed. The vault is cold, smelling of damp earth and old blood. The executioners wait in the gloom. They hold a thick, braided leather cord, worn smooth from previous use. They step behind him, wrap the cord around the Gaul's neck, cross the ends, and pull. The leather bites into the flesh. Vercingetorix's hands rise instinctively, fingers clawing at the cord. The executioners plant their heavy boots against his spine, leaning back, putting the entire weight of their bodies into the pull. The Gaul's jaw locks. Above them, the muffled, rhythmic cheering of the Roman masses vibrates through the stone ceiling. The executioners hold the tension until his hands drop to his sides and his knees buckle. While some ancient texts suggest this terminal strangulation occurred at the very climax of the procession, others imply a later date, the exact timing lost to the shadows of the archive. Yet the symbolism is absolute. The Gaul's hands drop to his sides. His knees buckle. The executioners release the cord. The body hits the stone floor with a dull, heavy thud. They grasp his ankles. They drag him out through a side corridor. His body is thrown upon one of the refuse heaps of the city. As the masses roared with approval at the death of a foreign enemy, they were utterly blind to the reality. They were effectively applauding the very autocratic machinery that was suffocating their own ancient liberties. Caesar was passing through the Velabrum on the first day of his Gallic triumph, and the axle of his chariot broke, and he was nearly thrown out. Suetonius records this without comment, without explanation. The record simply states that it happened. The Lexicon of Conquest. Following a brief interval, the spectacle resumed, bringing the exotic and the terrifying to the streets. The Alexandrian triumph dazzled the crowd with depictions of the Nile and the towering lighthouse of Pharos, bringing the riches of the Ptolemies to the Tiber. The wealth of the Ptolemies was displayed on litters. Forced to march in chains was Arsinoe IV, the rebellious princess of Egypt, and the infant Juba II of Numidia. The sight of a royal woman and a mere child in bondage provoked an unusual murmur of pity from the Roman mob. Yet, unlike Vercingetorix, they were spared. While ancient historians often attribute this mercy to the pity of the crowd, modern political analysis suggests a colder calculus. Gaul was a completed conquest, requiring a terminal demonstration of Roman finality. Arsinoe and Juba were merely pawns, highly useful for the ongoing, intricate chess game of dynastic client-state politics. But it was on the third day, the Pontic Triumph, that the sheer arrogance of Caesar's New World Order was crystallized into text. Rather than elaborate depictions of prolonged sieges, Caesar stripped away the pageantry to reveal the terrifying, mechanical efficiency of his military genius. Massive wooden placards swayed above the marching columns, standard bearers gripping the heavy poles, their muscles straining against the weight. As the biographer Suetonius recorded in his accounts of Caesar's life, on the boards, painted in massive, stark letters to precede the spoils of King Pharnaces, were only 3 words: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. 3 verbs. No nouns. No mention of the Senate. No invocation of the Roman people. It reduced a complex geopolitical conflict in Asia Minor to a personal errand. It mocked the Senate's protracted debates and the failures of previous commanders. Modern linguists and historians recognize it as a calculated, minimalist dismissal of the Senate. It was a complete rejection of the detailed, respectful military dispatches traditionally required of Republican generals. In 3 words, Caesar declared that he answered to no one but himself. The plebeians read the words and roared louder. The senators read the words and stared at the dust beneath their sandals. The shattered taboo. If the first 3 days stretched the boundaries of Republican tradition, the final procession, the African triumph, shattered them completely. It was here that the most profound psychological clash of the month unfolded. This clash did not happen in the streets, but high on the raised platforms lining the triumphal route, among the surviving Roman aristocracy. They stood motionless, wearing the stark white togas of their station. Among them stood a patrician, observing the spectacle. He did not applaud. He did not move his large hands. The senators beside him maintained the same cold posture. For centuries, a sacred, unspoken taboo governed the triumph. Roman blood, spilled by Roman hands in civil war, was to be mourned, never flaunted. Caesar could not officially triumph over Roman citizens. He framed the procession as a victory over King Juba of Numidia. But the true enemy in Africa had been Caesar's fellow Romans. Intoxicated by his own supremacy, he crossed the sacred line. As the floats of the African procession rolled through the forum, ostensibly celebrating victory over King Juba I, the cheering of the crowd was met with a horrified, agonizing silence from the viewing stands. The historian Cassius Dio vividly records the agonizing psychological reality of that day. Carried through the streets were massive, graphic paintings depicting the violent deaths of Roman citizens, cives, who had dared oppose him. The senators were forced to gaze upon physical depictions of Scipio, plunging a sword into his own chest and hurling himself into the sea. They saw Petreius falling on his sword at a banquet. And, Most provocatively, they saw the gruesome suicide of the Republic's most stalwart defender, Marcus Porcius Cato, tearing out his own bowels in Utica. They looked at the paintings of their dead colleagues. They did not react. Clementia was valid only for the living, not for the dead. Caesar paraded their deaths with care in the street, because he could not pardon dead men. What Appian records about the crowd's reaction is worth staying with. The crowd that watched paintings pass groaned. The word Appian uses for the crowd's prior state is intimidated. They were intimidated. Then they groaned. The spectacle intended to project invulnerability instead exposed the bitter, unresolved trauma of the Civil War. Then, for the image of Achilles and Pothinus, the Egyptian courtiers who had arranged Pompey's murder, they were exultant. For the image of Pharnaces, in flight at Zela, they laughed. Caesar explicitly omitted images of his greatest rival, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, perhaps as a hollow gesture of respect, but the damage was done. In the private correspondence of Marcus Tullius Cicero, a contemporary senator who witnessed these events, we find the deep psychological scars of an aristocratic class that suddenly found itself obsolete. Witnessing the paraded deaths of their peers was a profound, silent humiliation. It was Caesar's stark, unapologetic declaration of their complete obsolescence. Today, scholars of autocratic transitions debate the intent. Did Caesar deliberately weaponize this political theater to humiliate the aristocracy? Or did he genuinely believe he was acting within the traditional bounds of a conqueror, fatally miscalculating the extent of senatorial alienation? Whatever the motive, they were forced to witness their own funeral. The Republic was dead. They were merely the ghosts appointed to attend it. The anatomy of bribery. To ensure the silence of the aristocracy, Caesar needed the fierce loyalty of his legions and the absolute complicity of the streets. He required systemic bribery on a scale never before witnessed in human history. He opened the state treasury, and carts groaning under the weight of plundered foreign bullion rolled through the avenues. The scale of the physical plunder defied comprehension. Appian recorded the exact figures. 60,000 talents of silver. 2,822 golden crowns weighing 20,414 pounds. The physical weight of the gold required hundreds of men to move it. These were the accumulated extraction of a continent, Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, Numidia. All of it was funneled into a single sequence of displays along the streets of Rome, visible to every citizen who could find a position along the route. The soldiers hurled sesterces into the throng, and the exhausted masses broke their ranks. They surged forward, a tidal wave of desperate bodies, falling to their knees. They clawed at the stone pavement, pushing each other aside, their fingers bleeding as they scraped the silver coins from the dirt. The noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of clinking metal, shouting men, and weeping women. They traded their ancestral liberty for a handful of stamped silver. They cheered the man who bought them. The dictator watched them crawl. Suetonius meticulously details the astronomical distributions. Every single veteran infantryman who had marched under Caesar's eagles received a staggering 24,000 sesterces. It was a sum that could buy estates and secure a family's future for generations. Centurions received double that amount. Tribunes received quadruple. For the civilians, every eligible male citizen received 400 sesterces in gleaming coin, alongside 10 modi of grain and 10 pounds of pure olive oil. But the sheer logistical scale of his bribery went further, transforming the city into an open-air tavern. Appian records with astonishment that Caesar ordered 22,000 triclinia, or dining couches, to be set up across the public spaces of Rome. A single triclinium could accommodate 3 people at a time. In total, this was a logistical undertaking providing a public banquet for over 66,000 men simultaneously. Falernian wine flowed like rivers. The finest meats and imported delicacies were served to the poorest of the plebs. The gladiatorial games commenced. Criminals and prisoners of war fought to the death. Appian lists them: horse racing, musical contests, infantry combat of 1,000 against 1,000. There was cavalry combat of 200 against 200, mixed infantry and cavalry combat, and an elephant fight with 20 beasts on each side. A naval battle, with 4,000 oarsmen and 8,000 marines on each side, was staged in a massive artificial basin dug in the Codetta Minor. 2 fleets, representing Tyrians and Egyptians, destroyed each other for the amusement of the mob. The slaughter of thousands became mere entertainment. The Roman people cheered the bloodshed. The Roman populace drank deeply of this intoxicating wealth. Yet, this feast disguised a grim demographic reality. The Greek philosopher Plutarch observed that a census taken shortly after the triumph revealed a devastating reduction in the registry of citizens eligible for the public grain dole, dropping precipitously from 320,000 to a mere 150,000. While modern analysis suggests this reflected a restructuring of the dole rather than an apocalyptic population collapse, its sociological meaning is profound. The Roman people, once the sovereign lawmakers and active participants of a proud republic, had been officially reduced to the dependent subjects of an autocrat's generosity. They traded their voices for bread, and their freedom for circuses. The citizens took the silver coins. They surrendered their political agency for currency. The transaction was complete. The republic was liquidated. This wealth did not merely vanish into the pockets of the plebeians. It was carved into the very topography of Rome. Just adjacent to the traditional Roman Forum, the ancient heart of republican debate, vast new foundation lines were laid. This would become the Forum of Caesar, dominated by the Temple of Venus Genetrix. It was a permanent, architectural manifestation of his divine lineage. It was an enclosed space of absolute power that bypassed the old democratic institutions entirely. The Senate met in his buildings. They walked on his marble. The old Forum Romanum, the heart of the Republican debate, was overshadowed by the new architectural reality. The altar of Hubris. The terrifying hubris of this month-long pageant reached its theatrical zenith as evening fell. Caesar made his final ascent to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. The sun had set, but the hill was ablaze. He was flanked by 40 massive elephants, each carrying blazing torches in their trunks, illuminating the encroaching darkness. It was a projection of an aura of Hellenistic kingship, elevating Caesar from a Roman magistrate to a living god, an image Rome had always despised. In a bizarre display of false modesty, perhaps sensing the silent terror he had instilled in the patrician class, Suetonius notes the curious detail that Caesar ascended the final steps of the temple on his knees. Up above, on the steps of the Capitol, the sacrifices began. The priests raised the axes. The blades fell. The blood of the bulls gushed over the white marble. Caesar stood at the summit, the young boy at his side. The patricians watched the blood pool on the steps. They did not speak. They looked at the crimson stains spreading across the stone, smelling the metallic tang of the blood and the smoke of the burning fat. The Quadruple Triumph of 46 BC was, ultimately, an orchestrated theater of dominance. By intoxicating the Roman masses with unprecedented, overflowing wealth, and by brutally crushing both foreign resistance in the form of Vercingetorix and domestic republican ideals through the mockery of Cato's death, Caesar created a magnificent, suffocating spectacle. He had conquered the world, and he had bought Rome. The dictator surveyed the scene. He saw the subjugated masses. He saw the broken aristocracy. He created an illusion of unassailable dominance. But this absolute control was a dangerous, glittering illusion. He believed the cheers of the bought crowd were the voice of a grateful nation. He believed the silence of the Senate was the silence of obedience. By publicly humiliating the men who still called themselves senators, and institutionalizing his autocracy so brazenly, Caesar fatally severed himself from the reality of his own vulnerability. The theater of dominance had blinded him. The senators who sat in silent agony did not forget. The triumphal route, paved with gold and blood, ultimately led to the theater of Pompey. This blindness, born in the blinding light of 4 unprecedented triumphs, would culminate in the flash of daggers on the Ides of March, just 2 years later, when the humiliated aristocracy would finally pierce the purple robes of the dictator. September ended. The shows concluded. The distributions were paid. The temple was dedicated. Rome went back to its routines, and the year that the Romans called the Year of Confusion, the year Caesar added 90 days to align the calendar with the sun, eventually reached its end. When the last torches had guttered out on the Capitoline Hill, the street sweepers came down into the Velabrum. They came with broad brooms and clay lamps, working through the debris of a month-long festival. Broken garland stems, discarded wine cups, the dried blood from the sacrifice stones. Near the base of the Arch of Janus, one of them stopped. He bent down and picked up a section of broken wood. The iron collar was still attached. He did not know what it was from. He threw it onto the cart with the rest of the refuse.